them, and it's about looking at the engagement of people of ethnic minorities in the outdoors. So we have Jeddah and Laura flown in specially from California for our first presentation. So what I'm going to do is give them a kind of a 20-minute space, and then we'll take some questions. Then we'll have Mohammed, our other next door neighbour, our closer next door neighbour, who's come from the UK, and we'll give Mohammed 20 minutes, 5 minutes of question, and then we can do an overall questioning session of the two at the end. You're happy with that? Everybody in the audience happy enough with that? Okay, great.
Awesome.
Take it away.
Thank you. I'm going to turn this on. Great.
Hey y'all, I'm Jeddah Foreman. I'm from the University of California, Berkeley, from the Lawrence Hall of Science, which is UC Berkeley's Public Science Center. And Laura and I are going to be sharing about an ongoing project that we're still working on, and but we're going to share some of the research and evaluation that preceded some of this work to kind of figure out and make a case for why this work was so important. As part of the University of California, Berkeley, we have a pretty big research team and a lot of resources for research and evaluation, and we wanted to make sure that in this work we were working with Youth Outside and Laura and her team as a leader. The Youth Outside is really a leader in the field of equity, inclusion, and cultural relevance across the United States. And in particular, there's many organizations that are doing that work in the States, and in particular, we wanted to work with Youth Outside for their systems level and systems change perspective around equity and inclusion that's still grounded in the individual work and the individual journey. And also, we really wanted to work with them for their willingness to call us out and give us feedback when we make mistakes and to work with us to get better. And so with that, I will give it over to Laura to provide a little bit of context, and we'll be going back and forth for a few minutes.
You hold that. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Jeddah, for those kind words. My name is Laura Rodriguez. I'm Director of Programs at Youth Outside. I like to think of it as calling in. You know, there's space for both, but we like to call our friends in and just have this continued opportunity for growth and journey together. So yeah, we'll just move right along. Just to set a little bit of context, we know by what we can see that there is a lack of racial diversity in the outdoors. That there is just, particularly in the States, seems like it's true around the world from what I'm gathering, not as many numbers of folks, for a lot of reasons. Some of those reasons, perhaps that folks believe some reasons are rooted in myth. Some of them are rooted in narratives of truth as well. But just to give a little bit of context, Dr. Dorceta Taylor in 2014 published a report of findings that she had been doing research over a period of years and found, after having interviewed nonprofit organizations, the greater environmental field, the big green corporations, etc., that she coined this idea of a green ceiling that is true for folks of color in the space, which is that only 16% of the workforce inside of this space is folks of color. And that's true despite the fact that people of color are 36% of the US population and comprise 29% of the science and engineering workforce. And yet we have this green ceiling. And so that's what that term means. And so just to offer some context for why the Lawrence Hall of Science and Youth Outside came together to try to think about how we can support organizations in this field to make some systems level change and shift the needle a little bit. So a few guiding questions as we went into the initial phase, which was this surveying and research and finding out and evaluating, a little bit of a landscape analysis, if you will. These were some of our guiding questions. Particularly, how can we use the research? And I think there was perhaps a topic in an earlier session, sounds a little bit like this question to me, which is how can we use what we find and things that we publish, information that we're gathering, to lift up the voices of people of color that have been marginalized in this field. And we want to invite you to think about that throughout our next 20 to 15 minutes as well. How can organizational leaders and educators, or how do they define these terms that we use all the time? Like Lynn Anderson said this morning, right? I was really glad to see her take some time to define the terms and say, this is what I mean when I use these terms. You know, can we all be on the same page about that? But it was, so for us, it was, how are folks that are in positions of leadership, how are they defining these terms? How are they approaching these terms, and what is true for how folks of color are understanding, internalizing, experiencing these terms, also defining these terms. We wanted to just really be able to see what was happening for both groups. And then lastly, how is equity, inclusion, and or diversity addressed in organizational goals? Like how is it showing up in practice? How are people prioritizing? How are they manifesting in changes in policies and procedures? How are they working intentionally to create a different work environment? We might call that an organizational culture, right? How are we working to shift a culture?
Great, so we'll just, since we don't have much time, go through the participants and methods slides pretty fast here. So just to say first off, as we were developing our protocols, we did a lot of calling in, and we included our community partners. You can see Youth Outside, but also, Latino Outdoors, Yes Nature to Neighborhoods, and Chrissy Field Center are community-based organizations that we're integral, embedded part of this process, working on every step of the way with us, and with our evaluators and our research specialists. And part of the reason for doing that was, one, just to acknowledge that doing surveys, doing focus groups have the possibility, the potential to trigger folks, to re-traumatize folks, depending on the way that questions are asked or phrased, or asking people to relive experiences that were not necessarily positive. And so we really wanted to work with community partners to minimize the harm that our protocols were having or could potentially have. So what we ended up with, we had a survey of organizational leaders, so these are people in positions of power at outdoor environmental education organizations across the United States. So they're CEOs, directors of organizations, education directors, etc. So there's 51 folks that responded to the survey. We know from the research that these folks are predominantly white, but we did not ask them to identify their race or ethnicity on the survey. And so we're not making any claims about that, but they're all folks that are in positions of power in organizations. And then we did 3 focus groups with educators who all identified as a person of color. And they're from a variety of different organization types and sizes, and had different levels and amounts of experience in the field.
Here, I'll give that back to you. Sorry. That's okay. So the findings that we're going to share with you are, just to say again, they are both what we found from the perspective of organizational leaders as well as folks that identify as individuals of color. We really wanted to understand, again, those things that I just mentioned. So we're going to go into the details of all of those things. I don't want to be too redundant. Again, I want to invite, these perspectives really do reflect the lived experience of folks who are in the greater field. Some of the perspectives may resonate with you. Some of them may not. Some of them might make you wonder why that's a perspective or an experience that folks are having. Wherever you might land in terms of how you're receiving this, what we want to invite is that we all hold that this is someone's lived experience and therefore their truth, right? And so we might want to feel inclined to challenge that, and the practice is to validate that that's the experience that folks are sharing, regardless of which group we're hearing these perspectives from. And so just a couple of questions to keep in mind. That's okay. Just a couple of questions again to keep in mind as we think about these findings. How might the systems or practices that exist reinforce the ideas or the experiences? And what types of strategies might we support or might support shifting the systems or the practices? So first we asked folks, what does equity, inclusion, and or diversity mean to you? And we were very intentional about separating that out, and or, because some folks, As you might know already from personal experience, or as you've noticed in this conference, right, some folks might say equity and inclusion, others say DEI, others say JEDI, others say all kinds of things. So we wanted to just be very intentional to separate them out, that while they're often used in this like one word acronym, DEI, that we separated them out so folks had the space to respond to whichever of the words, maybe all three of them, they felt they had something to respond about. So for organizations, essentially the takeaway from this is that organizations tended to focus their definitions around access for all learners or all people, and really sort of sat there, right? It was interesting to see that, right? That equity was described as providing access to organizations. No one disagrees with that. And that's about as far as it went. So access for all, and that's sort of the extent of how folks were thinking about it. Thinking about inclusion as like the idea of creating a safe or welcoming environment, but easy enough to be said, right? And then thinking about diversity in terms of creating or fostering an environment where folks can show up as who they are and have their differences respected. The educators that were interviewed through the focus groups, the educators of color, the distinction is that they really wanted to go deeper with these definitions, right? What does it require for equity to happen? And so while the top part is all the same from the previous slide, it's the stuff down in the third row that the educators of color really wanted to highlight, right? Equity requires recognizing and responding to the historical oppression within environmental education, right? It's not enough to say, oh, equity is about access for all, right? That if we're not actually addressing the historical and current oppression of folks, we're not actually gonna get very far in our efforts. That inclusion requires listening to, learning about, and sharing the narratives of communities and the land, validating that there is a relationship between folks of color and those lands and the environment, right? Versus perhaps perpetuating a narrative that folks of color don't have a relationship with the land, and so therefore they must be helped to get there. And then diversity requires examining the intersectionality of culture and how it impacts equity and inclusion, right?
And also that understanding systemic oppression, power, and privilege kind of undergirds and is the foundation for all of that. And that equity, inclusion, and diversity can't be understood without also understanding systemic oppression and power and lack of power and privilege and lack of privilege.
Great. So, you're on.
Oh. All right, so next we looked at how equity, inclusion, and diversity are prioritized in organizations. So when we talked to the organization leaders, pretty much everyone across the board on a scale of 1 to 4 said, yeah, this is super important to us. You can see the averages are all between 3 and 4 for each of the 3 different terms, right? And that 2/3 of the organizations reported having equity, the words equity, inclusion, or diversity in one of their guiding documents. And so when we talked to the educators and we said, what is your lived experience of this? What does this actually mean? The story was a little bit different, right? It was that organization leaders are talking about it a lot, that it's this hot topic, but that the impact is not necessarily felt in the way that organization leaders are intending it to be felt. And so what the educators of color were saying is that almost exclusively when organization leaders are talking about equity, inclusion, and diversity, they're talking about scholarships for students of color. They're talking about providing better busing opportunities to bring people into their organizations, but they're not talking about their own work environment. They're not reflecting on their own organization and how they're supporting their staff. And so this is a quote from someone in the focus group that I'll read out loud. I feel like every outdoor job I've worked on, organizations are always promoting that they're trying to be more diverse by hiring more diverse people or trying to bring more diverse schools in there. But it's not apparent because you end up being the one black guy or there's one other black girl or Asian or Hispanic person. So I don't really know what the goal is in terms of them saying they're wanting to diversify. So they're hearing it said a lot, but they're not, it's not clear what that actually means.
Isn't that to maintain hierarchy, you know?
Yeah. So a couple other quotes here about how the status quo is actually, that these efforts to promote equity, inclusion, and diversity actually end up maintaining the status quo because they're led and instituted by white leadership. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is this white savior complex that is really creating a separatist movement where there is still a form of other. People of color are still an other, and white leadership still have, white leadership still have dominance. Diversity, equity, and inclusion always comes from the top down. They are never from the grassroots or from the community. And another quote, I want organizations to straight up acknowledge that environmentalism was created by people of color first. I had a huge disconnect that my ancestors were a part of the environmental movement and honored the earth, and then the colonizers came in and took that away from them and converted them. And now I'm in 2018 trying to say I've been connected to this my whole life. This isn't something that you're teaching me and awakening me to. That's it.
That's it. And then that person dropped the mic and went home. Okay, so we have our 5-minute warning, and we're going to move right along. The next question that we really wanted to focus on inside of this space, and also this was like originally an 86-page slide, and we have printed in greater detail about that process as well. I don't want to forget to say that, but we'll just move right along. In what ways do organizations foster equity, inclusion, and or diversity within staff environment? And what we heard from organizations were a word bubble, right? Here's just an example of some of the things that came up for organizational leaders. Generally, when we ask them, hey, how's your organizational culture? How's the work environment? How would you describe it? What do you think's going on? They would describe it as pretty highly a positive space with words like supportive, passionate, community, collaborative, right? And again, that's their lived experience. This is not necessarily that folks are just trying to sell that, right? That this is, as organizational leaders, that's what they're experiencing. Another thing that they mentioned in terms of practical ways to sort of foster a positive work environment or an equitable work environment was through creating feedback loops, however regular they might be. On the other hand, when we heard educators' perspectives about the work environment, it was a pretty different scenario and a lived experience that they were describing, right? They experienced things like culture shock when they were the only person of color, as the quotes reflected. Difficulty with navigating a white culture with white values on a daily basis. They're consistently feeling isolation or tokenization. If these words are feeling new to you, come find us, we can talk, or you can also Google this, just waiting for things to be Googled. And then again, just in regards to the effectiveness of feedback loops, some folks reported that, in some cases when they brought up challenges or when they confronted a difficult conversation, they were told things like, you're making everyone very uncomfortable. I just want to take a moment to offer this really powerful quote as well. I've only been doing environmental education for 2 years and I'm over it. I don't want to do it anymore. I feel like my job would have been ideal if I didn't feel so marginalized in this space. I feel like I have 2 jobs. I feel like I have to do my job and also exist in a really white space. Racist burnout is real.
I'm mostly going to skip over this for the sake of time, but just to mention that we did talk about hiring practices with folks, that the leaders tended to almost exclusively say, well, we don't get job applications from people of color, or the qualifications of the job don't match the lifestyle of people of color. And what we heard from the educators over and over and over and over again was, well, the hiring practices are inherently racist. They're biased against me. My lived experiences aren't honored, and they're not showing up in the qualifications for these jobs, and so why would I apply? And there's a lot more about that in the publication here that you're all welcome to take one of. So just want to end with this kind of general statement that that while organizations are actively thinking about and engaging in this dialogue, they end up maintaining the status quo, especially when things get uncomfortable, right? And so, you already mentioned the feedback thing. Yeah, so the question for us is, how can we as organizations shift our systemic practices and our structures in order to challenge the status quo and actually push forward equity, inclusion, and cultural relevance efforts? And finally, we'll end with this slide, which is recommendations that came out of the focus groups from the educators about what we can do to actually make this work and how to push it forward. And there's examples and descriptions of what each of these mean in this publication.
And just again, this was this information we collected to inform how we would design an institute for self-selecting organizations who are like, yes, in teams of 2 or 3, I want to come together and carve out concrete action and concrete plans. So this was an important framing, an important first step to help inform how we would work as intentionally as possible to create an impactful experience for all of them. And that's the part that we're in right now. We're delivering on those institutes for 6 or 7 organizations currently. So we'll end there.
And that resource is also available online as well as the hard copies here.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have any questions for Jeddah and Laura? Anybody like to, anybody wondering about any aspect of their work?
How we created more opportunities for people, and we found ways to create more opportunities for people of color in relationship to that. You know, ways to kind of try to formulate like that ways of changing that system, you know what I'm saying? Of the street kind of letting people of color be flushed in and then just kept in the bottom. How can we change that? Like,
Yeah.
that's what I'm thinking of now. Like,
We've got some efforts. This working with the leadership of organizations, but also inside of the Greater Institute, and part of that is to bring educators of color from within those organizations, also together in their own affinity space, exactly. But then also bring them all together, because these conversations cannot happen in silos, right? When folks of color come together in an affinity space, it's very productive, it's very restorative, it can lead to really great action. And we cannot dismantle racist systems on our own, right?
Yeah.
So we have to have folks who are in positions of power, to also be truly bought in. There are look us up. Youth Outside has a couple of or 3 different programs that work at the systems, all of the sort of the layers. So supporting folks of color in the entry point to get into the field, doing that in a supportive and holistic way, and creating a space where people's identities and their entire selves is celebrated in the outdoors, right? And dismantling some of these narratives that folks don't go outside, but then also along the ladder, supporting organizations and people within them. So look us up.
yeah, I will definitely.
Did you add anything to that?
Just to say, so Laura mentioned this kind of pilot workshop series that we're doing with 7 organizations in California to kind of try and work really closely with them, offer coaching and technical assistance, and really figure out through workshops with leaders and the educators of color at those organizations what those concrete steps really look and feel like. And then hopefully we'll be writing more and kind of detailing out those efforts and what that looks like and turning that into a bigger project.
I have one more question. Have you done research on how like these outdoor organizations, like, you know, because they're looking at monetary aspects of like, you know, looking at a right market, and sometimes they'll look at like, let's say, the black race and like, okay, they're not the right market because some of them are poor, yada 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 yada. Have you done research on that and how they target certain people in the community so they can make money out of them, like keep certain people in the community out? Have you done research like that?
Us directly, no, but
Yeah.
there is research out there, and I would write this down. Outdoor Afro. They present out on information that actually demonstrates that the black community, the African American community in the United States, is a powerful powerful community that purchases, you know, and just so that their purchasing power, and
Yeah,
really
exactly.
bringing light to the fact that while that might be a stereotype,
Yeah.
it's actually not true,
Yeah.
right? And that their purchasing power can really be harnessed. And so there's
Exactly.
research out there that shakes that up a little bit.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
We do.
Thanks for that a lot. Just a very quick observation. This is a huge topic. We could talk all day, and I know you're hugely passionate about it. That comes through, so thank you for that. It just struck me, the comment you made in a session before lunch where Kim and TA were presenting. You talked about this, a lot of this being top-down, and it's a huge problem. And it reminds me of climate justice and climate change. As a white, heterosexual man of a certain age, you know, I come from an age where the world was very different, and at times feel really overwhelmed by the vastness of the problem in front of me, and I say, but what can I do? What difference will I make? And I think the comment you made earlier about we have to challenge the microaggressions, I'm familiar with that from the work of Mary Brunig, who makes that very clear. We can all do something about this, that we challenge on a daily basis in our practice, the microaggressions against race, gender, ethnicity, you know, all of that. So I would offer that out to folk and welcome your comment on that.
I would just add, there's a amazing author, writer, Ibram X. Kendi, who just wrote a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. He's a professor in DC, and I got a chance to hear him talk a couple of weeks ago, and he said the difference between an anti-racist and a racist is that an anti-racist, or that a racist will always deny. The heartbeat of racism is denial, denial, denial. They'll never say that they were racist. And an anti-racist will admit when they were racist and will acknowledge it and work to get better.
Love it. I'll tell you, we will take questions again at the end. I'd just like to give Mohammed a chance to get his presentation underway.
Thank you so much.
So the clock starts again, Mohammed.